Hello, in this video I want to continue some of the conversation that we were having in the last one in terms of talking about Derrida as an affirmative strategy. In the last video we talked a little bit about like some of the strengths and weaknesses and ways I think are just like the really important kind of like framing questions that you'll kind of see for how people usually think about Derrida on topics like the water resolution. And in this video I kind of want to continue some of that conversation talking about the way in which I think something that is a lot closer to ontology would deal with things like the criticism and counterplan dissent types of debates. But I think if you haven't, you should definitely tune into some of the earlier videos that I've done talking about Derrida, because I think things like the intro to Derrida can be really important in order for you to have like the really foundational background knowledge for a lot of stuff that we'll be talking about here, and just the understanding of ontology as a concept, because in these two particular videos it's not something that I really go on as much it's not really something that I talk about like as directly, or that I talk about in a way that is really explanatory compared to the intro video. And so I think that if you're having a hard time really catching up with some of the stuff that I'm talking about in terms of ontology and what I mean, then the intro video can be really helpful, and the rest of the videos along the way show a lot of like the uses and application of ontology up until this point, so that you can kind of understand the many uses and contextual explanations of it, so that when you get here it's like really not as confusing. I think that for this particular video, like I said, I would kind of be continuing some of the thought process that I had in the last one, where we kind of start with the explanation of just like how we can make the tie between the spectral presence of particular types of structural injustice, the voices of those that have like been violently kind of like dealt with by the state, etc., and thinking about the way in which it ties to different type of arguments that we met in debate, that you kind of like meet with in debate. And I think that in the context of like criticisms especially, thinking about the way in which you can like apply Derrida is like really, really important, because I think there are a lot of like really good criticisms out there about maybe some of the limitations of like ontology as a particular practice, and like the kind of like telos of ontology. I think that a lot of critical literature that like kind of is framing ontology is thinking about how it can criticize it from the perspective of like ontology being used as something to convince like those that have like power over these particular structures to like change their ways because they come to terms with ghosts. And I definitely think that you need to reframe a lot of these questions that the criticism is kind of pushing to ask in that sense. Like, I don't think that you should just say that ghosts haunt those that are able to like create that are like holding power and is meant to make like people more ethical that are already kind of like committed to doing unethical practices, but is rather about the way in which we understand the ghosts as kind of like necessary conduits for how we create our own political action for those that experience like the trauma of those ghosts all the time. I think that it's particularly important for you to be able to like have clear conversation about stuff like this, and be able to pinpoint the difference between thinking about ghosts as something that is meant to like convince others, and not a ghost as something that is just supposed to inform like cultural memory and like ways of like communing. And I think being able to separate the goal of the two is something that you need to do like early on in the debate as possible against criticisms, because I think the second that you kind of like take that moment across, like, so the explanation in the 1AC to be like the important part is like the usage of ghosts in order to change the way in which like people make political decisions, or that like political leaders make decisions, when in actuality I think the better usage of ontology as a practice is to think about the way in which communities that are affected and still like kind of like see the impacts of the kind of specters that are haunting these systems, to kind of use them as ways to like think about like various types of organizing practices that move like counter intuitive to those kind of like social institutions. I think that this is particularly important for when you're thinking about how you kind of want to frame maybe the like how the linked debate goes against the criticism in general, because I think that when you're trying to figure out how to really beat down this strategy, it can be really hard to like separate or do a lot of explanatory like explanation for this. But I think that, for instance, the way that you can really show this on the flow is that if you go to the alternative, and when you get to the alternative portion of the debate, you're really like pushing the negative to answer the question of like how does the kind of like alternative take into context the way in which like various forms of violence like slavery, genocide have accumulated, and why is that different in the process of ontology. Then I think that there's a really interesting way that you can always position the affirmative as like having this kind of like prerequisite type of relationship to a lot of the methods that are offered by criticisms. And I think it can be a lot harder for them to win that they can separate the way in which like the method from the alternative is created from like the spectral presence of like similar things that you're talking about in the affirmative, while also winning the criticism has like some deeper relationship to the app as a whole. So I think in a world where they're really making a strategy that really contends with the affirmative's kind of like use of ontology as an effective strategy, they would also be like forced to take up an alternative that like is meant to deal with the specters of those that have kind of like suffered from like various forms of structural violence. I think this is true even of criticisms that take a more like rejection fueled or refusal fueled route in the alternative basis, because even the basis for like why things need to be refused is usually on the grounds of the way in which those like bodies, those that have already been haunted, have like already done like so much labor in the context of these kind of structural injustices. And I think that just in general it's a lot lot harder to, it's a lot easier to win, that like those things require us to take in like the lessons, etc., of like history and specters, than to win that there's like this grand separation between them, and that the creation of these political methodologies is completely separate from like how history is like organized itself. I think that when you're kind of like switching this onto like what my advice would be for like how you deal with counterplans and dissets, I think a lot of them will basically make a lot of arguments about why, even in a world where there's kind of like this critique that ontology does of the way in which like increased privatization, increased kind of like an increased neoliberal ordering of the way in which we think about water protections probably moves against the grain, against like a lot of the kinds of critiques that want to be making against the affirmative. I think that like I kind of said with a lot of these other post-structural criticisms, that you'll really have to deal with something that feels a lot closer to like an impact turn, or I think maybe a counterplan or a dissent that feels like it is attempting to like do something that is like politically viable via like its ability to say that it's using like the power of goose, or like that it's like taking the knowledge from specters in order to create like particular political demands. And I think that that both those routes can be really interesting, and so I want to talk about a little bit about how I think you can deal with both. I think that when you're on the route where people are kind of like leaning into a more impact turn based strategy, I really think that you need to make a lot of arguments that allow you to scale up your impact to explaining how specters not only like require us to take in the context of how the decisions we make leave us responsible or accountable for like the dead around us, but also the way in which how specters live and die kind of like control the way in which people that are alive today live and die, and the way in which that kind of continuous structure of systems makes it impossible for us to think about a world where the counterplan and dissent kind of operates outside of those kind of like structures of violence, and the ability of them to like assume that there's kind of like a future basis that breaks off from the way in which these structures have continually produced violence is like isn't warranted by like the kind of debate that's happening about history broadly. And I think in that sense it's really just a question of being able to like position yourself, much like some of the advice that I gave when I was talking about how ontology relates to like policy affirmatives when red is a negative strategy. So hopefully that video kind of helps as a reference to kind of like fill in the gaps for some of the advice I'm giving here and how you should be generating that offense. But I think on the other side, when a team is trying to read a counterplan and dissent that says that we can do politics while like being able to invest in the ability to be responsible or accountable towards specters, I really think that you need to like make and build a strong critique out of your affirmative that really explains why the state and its ability to be accountable to specters is impossible with the existence of the state, because true accountability would mean the obliteration of like civil society of the state and those institutions like as we know it, and that would kind of be like the only reparative kind of necessary, and making arguments about how ontology is supposed to inform revolutionary action that gets us closer to like the kind of like abolition of that system, but like the only thing that can be like allowed is abolition of that system. I think could be a really good place for you to kind of like hold the line on the counterplan and dissent and really invoke a lot of the offense that I think is like reminiscent of like how other criticisms have like a stronger theory towards the state. And I think really just pushing that level of just like the state is too far gone to be responsible for or be accountable towards these specters is like really a good place for you to maybe like lean in for some of this offense. Hopefully this is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune in for more and in order to get a better idea of some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in order for Derrida to finish up this series. And yeah, thanks a lot.